first part of this video we discussed traditional mortgages and the reason why traditional mortgages are going to incentivize the best types of homeowners, the best type of borrowers. So for example, on a $100,000 house, down payment would probably be at 20% for most people, which means they're going to owe $80,000 plus interest. And the benefit of this down payment is twofold. One, it serves as a signal. Only the people who are responsible, the people who have good incomes, are going to be able to make that down payment. So you get a good pool of people borrowing money. And then the second incentive is you don't want to default on your payments, because if you default, you're going to lose this big $20,000 that you just put down. So it's going to incentivize those who owe money to continue paying it back. So what happens is in these mortgages, it's quite frequent that the borrower, the future homeowner, does indeed pay back the bank for these transactions. On the other hand, we have subprime mortgages that occurred really beginning pretty far back, became very prevalent in the 2000s. In these mortgages for a $100,000 house, the down payment would be as low as 3.5%, as low as $3,500, which means that the borrower is going to owe $96,500 plus interest, and that interest rate is going to be higher because borrowers like this tend to be high risk. The problem is twofold. One, it encourages riskier borrowers to borrow money, which means that the types of people who are applying for these loans are going to be, in general, riskier than the types of people who would be applying here. There's simply just more people that have this amount of money than this. And the types of person who wants the very low down payment is probably the type of person who doesn't have a lot of money. So they're more risky in terms of the likelihood of them paying it back. And the second problem is it lowers the cost of defaulting. Remember, defaulting means simply to walk away, to stop making repayments, and the house goes to the bank. Because in this case, if this person walks away, they only lose the $3,500. In this case, in a traditional mortgage, the person loses $20,000. So it simply makes it cheaper for someone to default on their homes. So all of that being said, why would banks ever want to offer these mortgages? Why would they ever be willing to do this? Well, it has to do with the history of mortgages and the fact that prices have been going up over time. So let's think about the scenario that banks are in. So let's consider a house that is being purchased in 1990. Okay? A house is being purchased in 1990. And so let's stick with that $100,000 price, and let's say that's the purchase price. So the price here would be $100,000. Okay? And there's some equilibrium quantity. And so the person that purchased this house is the bank. The bank is the one that actually buys the house. Excuse me. And the borrower is going to pay the bank back until they've paid in full, at which point it's their house. The individual never really owns the house until they've repaid the bank entirely. So banks own a lot of houses. Okay? Banks own, I think most houses actually are owned by banks right now in the U.S. So here's the issue. In this situation, the down payment in a traditional mortgage would be $20,000, like we've said before, and the homeowner owes $80,000 plus interest. And so let's think about the potential outcomes of this mortgage. Two things can happen. The first potential outcome is the transaction goes smoothly and the homeowner pays in full. And let's think about what that would mean for the bank. What does the bank get out of this? If the homeowner pays in full, why is this good for the bank? Well, this is good for the bank because the bank is getting interest. That's how banks make their profits for the most part, is through interest. So this is going to be a really good deal for the bank. After all, if it's not a good deal for the bank, why would they have agreed to it? So this is going to be profit for the banks. Okay, so the bank profits. This is good for the homeowner, most likely, because the homeowner gets a house that they otherwise couldn't have afforded. So it's good for them as well. Okay. The other possibility is the homeowner defaults. The borrower, the potential homeowner, defaults. And let's think about what's going to happen now. Okay. First of all, for the homeowner, this is going to be bad. The homeowner is going to lose their down payment, plus whatever payments they've been making so far. So maybe they purchased a house in 1990 and they default in 1996. Well, they've paid 20 grand plus all of those years of payments. They're losing out on a lot of money they put into this house. So this is definitely going to be bad for the homeowner. Now let's think about the bank. The bank sells a house in, let's say, the year 1996. Now, how much are they going to be able to sell this house for? The house was purchased in 1990, and then they're going to sell it in 1996. This is called a foreclosure, by the way. When a bank gets a house that the owner has stopped making payments on, the bank sells the house. That's called a foreclosure. You've probably heard about these before. They're pretty common. The thing is, between 1990 and 1996, what we've had is increases in demand. Demand is rising. It's rising because people expect housing prices to rise, so they want to buy. They want to buy, they want to buy. The economy's been really strong during this period too, and also we've had some subprime mortgages, right? Subprime mortgages make it easier for people to borrow, which means there's more people out there that are able to borrow money for a house. So demand is rising. Simultaneously, supply is decreasing. Supply is decreasing because people realize that housing prices are going to go up, and if you think housing prices are going to go up, you don't want to sell your house, okay? So the end result is housing prices get driven up. And now maybe this house that was initially $100,000 is now worth $200,000. This is a very common thing, right? For housing prices to go up. If you bought a house in Atlanta in 1990, think about what that house would be worth today. It would have increased probably fourfold, something like that. So think about where the bank is at now. The bank gets $200,000 for the house because that's what the free market is allowing them to sell it for now. And the bank also got all of those payments made by this homeowner, okay, by the potential homeowner, the borrower. The bank also gets keeps whatever payments the initial borrower made. So that'll be the $20,000 plus whatever payments were coming in monthly from that homeowner. So the bank is going to make a massive profit off of this deal. Put yourself in the bank situation here. There's only two outcomes. One, the homeowner pays in full. That's good for you. Or two, the borrower defaults. And that's been good always too, because as long as housing prices go up, it means you can sell the house for more than the bank initially paid for it. So this is a win-win situation for the bank. So if you're a bank, what do you want to do? You want to do as many housing purchases as possible. You want to get as many people making mortgages as possible. And that's what led to having so many of these subprime mortgages. Basically, the bank has been doing these deals, doing 20% mortgages, 20% down payment, 20% down payment, 20% down payment on houses. And then they run out of people. They run out of people who can afford a 20% down payment. So what do? They look for people who can do a 3.5% down payment. And so now what we have is lots of homeowners who only put down a tiny amount of money, probably because they're pretty irresponsible, they don't have high incomes, and since they've only put down a little bit of money, they owe a lot on their house. So that's a situation we are gradually moving towards, beginning really in the 1990s is when this began to be a problem, okay? As long as housing prices go up, the banks are going to profit either way, okay? And this is where they're at, and their goal was just to do as many mortgages as possible. to illustrate this point, let me show you the prices for housing through time here. So again, we'll look at 2-year increments through time just to give you a feel for how quickly housing prices were rising. And this is the average housing price for houses that were actually transacted, actually sold in bulk. So in 1997, the average housing price was about $197,000. By 99, it had grown to $217,000, and the growth continued. So this is the average housing price in the United States going from 1997 to 2007. And really the story would be the same. If you went back to, say, 87, you would continue to see the same trend of rising housing prices. So between 1997 and 2007, just over a decade, average housing prices nearly doubled in the United States. This is the same period where we had the boom in the creation of the internet, right? The creation and implementation of the internet. We had the baby boomers that were right at their primary working age. We had a lot of reasons why the economy was growing, and people were buying houses like crazy. And again, the issue here is if you think housing prices are going to rise, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think housing prices are going to rise, demand goes up because people want to buy the houses before they go up in price. If housing prices are expected to go up, supply goes down because you don't want to sell your house now if you think it's going to go up in price. So the result is rising housing prices. So every time it goes up, people say, wow, housing prices are going up. Houses are a good investment. Let's buy houses. And since people do that, the housing prices continue to go up. So you can see why buying a house seemed like a good investment and why people would want to do it. You can see why banks would definitely want to do as many housing transactions as possible. Even if people default on their loans, the bank gets a house and they can sell it for a lot more than what they paid for it, right? Somebody buys a house in 2003, they default in 2007, well, the bank can sell it and make a $100,000 profit right off the top. Plus, they're going to get whatever payments and the down payment the homeowners have. So the banks did tons and tons and tons of mortgages, okay? Everything's looking fine right now. But what we're going to have here now is a very quick and very painful collapse of the housing market. So part one was the boom. If you recall, I put that up here at the beginning of the last video. Part one was the boom, showing all the reasons why the economy was doing so well and the housing market was improving. Part two we could call the bust. So around 2007, the economy took a slight dip. When I teach this, a lot of times students want to know what was the cause of the dip. Why did the economy go bad? Doesn't really matter. The economy often goes through these periods where it grows, it shrinks. Not a big deal, right? There's expansions, there's contractions. We just had a little contraction, okay? But the results of this is people slowed their purchases of homes. Leading to a decrease in housing prices. Okay, so the economy took just a little downturn. People slowed their purchases of home, and we end up with a decrease in housing prices. And that is going to put everything in motion. That decrease in housing prices is the first step towards a disaster in our American economy. That's all it took. So here's what happens. one of my favorite concepts in economics to teach. This is an example where economic tools are so useful in explaining what happens. Here's the housing market in, let's say, 2007. Okay, 2007 was the turning point. Beginning of the year looked good. By the end of the year, a collapse was imminent. You could already see that things were getting really bad. So here's our market for housing. Here's supply. Here's demand. Here's our equilibrium house. Right, which we just showed. The average house in 2007 sold for $373,000. So I'm going to put 373K there. Okay? So what happens is housing prices have just dipped a bit. And I'm not going to worry about showing that on our graph over here, okay? Just imagine the housing prices have just gone down a little bit. And let's think about what that does. Okay? Let's think about what happens here. When housing prices dip, let's think about the effects on a subprime mortgage. For a $373,000 house, the minimum down payment would be 3.5%. Okay? So the down payment would be 3.5%, which in this case, doing some quick math, on a $373,000 house, which was an average house at the time, the down payment would be $13,055. Again, 3.5% down payment is the minimum that you're allowed, and so a lot of people choose the minimum because that's all they can afford. So there's your down payment, and that means that this person owes the rest of it. So they owe $359,945. Okay, let's just keep this in mind. Okay, here's our mortgage for now. And let's think about this mortgage over time when prices start to fall. Okay, so what happens is people expect housing prices to decline because they just did. So people expect housing prices to drop. This is basically a reverse of what we did in the last video. When people expect housing prices to rise, they do. When people expect housing prices to fall, they do. It does the same thing, but backwards. If people expect the housing prices to drop, then demand decreases. Keep in mind, I'm not saying that housing prices have dropped and then stabilized. I'm saying people expect them to continue to drop. So if you expect housing prices to continue to drop, you don't want to buy a house. You want to wait to buy a house. So your demand today decreases, right? Likewise, think about the supply side of things. If you think that your house can sell for more today than it can a year from now, you're more likely to want to sell your house today, right? If you think that something is going to sell for a cheaper price next year, you want to sell it now. So the supply increases. So the supply increases and the housing prices fall. Okay? So maybe now the equilibrium house is $320,000. Well, now we've got a very interesting issue for this homeowner up here. Remember, there's a lot of people that are in this situation. A lot of people have just bought houses. They've pretty much all done it at 3.5% down payments, and so they owe a tremendous amount of house because they put a tiny down payment down. So what's going to happen is homeowners like this person here, right? I'm calling them homeowners. I really shouldn't. They're really technically not homeowners. The bank owns the house. These are the borrowers, right? They're living in the house, but they're just paying the bank back until they pay in full. They're not technically homeowners. But what happens is the homeowners go underwater on their mortgage. And what that means is this person now owes, the value of their house is only $320,000, and they owe way more than that. They owe $359,945, and that's not even thinking about the interest. So this homeowner is now underwater. Think about what that means. They now owe more than the house is worth. What would you do if you owed more than your house is worth? You may choose to default. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about. In this scenario, it's actually arguably a good financial decision to default on purpose. And keep in mind, these people that we're talking about here, they're not doing financially great. That's part of the reason why they only put down 3.5% down payment. They probably don't have great credit scores. If they had great credit scores, they probably would have put down a bigger mortgage. In other words, if you have a really good credit score, you probably were the type of person to put 20% down, okay? So the type of person engaged in these loans probably has poor credit scores. So if they default on their home, it's going to ruin their credit score. But their credit score is probably not so great anyway. So it's not as big of a problem. So what happens is people default on their mortgages. Because they're underwater, some people default on their mortgages on purpose, okay? And what happens to the house after they've defaulted on their mortgage? The bank gets it, and the bank sells it. So the bank lists the house for sale. You know what that means? More supply. More supply over here in our housing market, which means lower prices. Okay, so prices drop, maybe to only 280. Housing prices drop to 280. What happens is when this drops, even more people go underwater, right? There are some people who owe, maybe they only owe, 290, right? They owe 290 on their house. Well, now they're underwater too, so they default on purpose. So these defaults continue to occur over and over again. Meanwhile, people don't want to buy houses, so demand continues to decrease. And we have a total collapse of the housing market. Once prices start to fall, because of all of these subprime mortgages and all of their incentives to default on their homes, the housing market is doomed and prices collapse in the housing market. This hit different places in different degrees. For example, in Atlanta did okay. Housing markets did horrible. Prices went way down, but relatively speaking, it did okay. But if you go to places like, say, Detroit, there were houses in Detroit that were for sale for $1 and people weren't buying them. If you own a house, you have to pay for insurance. You have to pay property taxes. And for these people, paying the property taxes wasn't worth the house, even if the house was free. So houses were listed for $1 in Detroit and they weren't selling. That's how bad the housing market was in Detroit and a lot of other places too. Cleveland was also another really bad place. So different places were hit to different degrees, but the housing market was totally collapsed. Here in Milledgeville, the average housing price is still lower than it was back in 2007. We still haven't gotten back to where we were. And that's probably a good thing because the housing market was overinflated in 2007. We had a bubble, and the bubble burst. Okay? So that's the collapse of the housing market. And unfortunately, this housing market is going to affect more than just the homeowners. So how mortgages affected everyone. I want to really focus on people who are investing. All right, so imagine, just to give you an example of how this affects everyone, let's think about your retirement plan. Let's think about your retirement plan and what's going to be in your retirement plan. In your retirement plan, you're probably going to have stocks, which is ownership in a company. You may have some bonds. Bonds, it's just a fancy way of saying an IOU, okay? So if a company issues bonds, that means they're borrowing money and they're going to pay you back with interest. And another thing you might have in these is something called a collateralized debt obligation, or a CDO. And a CDO is something that for housing markets technically kind of only exists. It doesn't exist in the way it did prior to the housing collapse, because we've changed the way we do, the way banks set up their investments. And in terms of retirees, their options are now different than they were back in 2007. So a collateralized debt obligation basically means that investors can get into the housing market. So what happens is investors pool funds to purchase houses, and then mortgage payments are paid to these investors. And it doesn't happen literally like this. It's not like I go, call up my friend and say, hey, what's up, Scott? Give me some money because we're going to pull some money together and go buy some houses and we'll get our mortgage payments. It doesn't work like that. It works like this. I go down to the bank, or I go online and I find some sort of online financial institution, put some money in, and I buy a little piece of a bunch of different mortgages, okay? So what happens is you've got all these houses that are in one of these collateralized debt obligations, and as that money comes in, a little chunk of that is going to go to me, all right? So as the money rolls in, I'm going to get a little piece of it. So I might buy $5,000 into this collateralized debt obligation, and that means out of every house, every time they pay, I get 1 cent, for example, okay? It's called a collateralized debt obligation because there is collateral. The collateral is the house. If these people stop making payments, the bank is going to foreclose on them and sell the house. And the money that goes for the sale of that house is going to go out to these investors. This gives investors a way to get some of the money from these mortgages because they want a chance to make profits too. Banks have been making a lot of profit off mortgages. The individuals do too. So a lot of retirement accounts had these collateralized debt obligations in them, okay? Investors often didn't know this was in their account because people don't usually actively manage their retirement accounts. It's rare for people to know really what's in their retirement account entirely because it's managed by their employer, right? So for example, if I have a 401k through my business, I may not know everything that's in my 401k, and CDOs may be one of those things. Nothing wrong with owning a CDO. It can be a good way to, diversify and earn profits, which may help you towards retirement. But what's interesting about these collateralized debt obligations is how they work and how banks manipulated these CDOs. So here's how a CDO works, and I'm going to send you guys a video that I think does a really good job of explaining this, probably better than I can. But what happens is you've got all these houses, and all these houses represent homeowners that have borrowed from banks, and they're paying the banks back. As that money rolls in, it's not literally going to go to the investor in most cases. Instead, the bank figured out a way to try to make these housing payments set up so that investors could choose how risky they want it to be. So what happens is when that money comes in, the first thing it does is fill up this, what's called a tranche, the top tranche of a collateralized debt obligation, okay? And then if it fills up the top one, it will begin filling up these lower tranches. Let me show you what I mean by this. When somebody makes a housing payment, they're going to the first bit of money is going to go into this top tranche, all right? Now this is just a metaphor to show what it looks like. But imagine it's like water filling a bucket, okay? As the money comes in, this top bucket is going to get filled first. And when it fills up entirely, when enough money's come in, it'll spill over and start filling up this bottom tranche. Like that. All right, so the middle tranche eventually may get full as well. And then if enough payments come in, then the bottom one gets filled too. Like that. Now let's think about realistically how this looks. If you're saving money, right, if you're investing into this account here, which one of these buckets would you like to own? They're called tranches, okay? I'll put that word here. I'm not going to test you on it. But these are called tranches. So which one of these tranches would you like to own? Probably this one, right? This is the one that's going to fill up first, so this one's the safest. The banks know that, and so they issue this one with a low interest rate. So maybe this one has a 2% interest rate, and this one is very likely to get filled, okay? So that top tranche, and I'm rethinking things. I may test you on tranche because it helps explain the questions when I ask them on the exam. This top tranche is very likely to get filled up, so this is essentially no risk to the investor, okay? So people who don't want to take on a lot of risk can put their money here. People who want a little bit of risk can put their money here, and maybe this one's 5%. It's higher interest because it's also higher risk. The only way this middle one fills up is if enough payments come in to fill up the top one first. And then this bottom one is actually pretty risky because a lot of housing payments have to come in for this one to fill up. So why do this? Why would the banks want to divide this up into different groups? The reason is because not everybody has an equal feeling or attitudes towards risk. Imagine I'm about to retire next year. I don't want to take any risk. I want to be safe with my money. So I might put it here. Now let's imagine instead that I'm only 25 years old. If you're 25 years old, you probably want to take on a lot of risk. You've got a lot of years till retirement, so you want to be risky because if you're risky over a long period of time, that's usually advantageous to being safe. So you might want to put your money here. So by doing this, this allows the bank to set it up so that this is appealing to more investors. Again, no problem with that. This is a fine way to organize a savings account or any type of investment. The problem is that banks and other financial institutions began doing something very strange. They began taking, all right, remember this is our safe up here, and this is our risky one down here. They began taking these bottom tranches, like this, packaging them together and creating a new set of collateralized debt obligation tranches from it, okay? So let me take a step back, okay? The way you invest in these is to put your money in, and money's going to come back to you from people paying their mortgages. You can make a profit off of this because the people are paying interest. So basically it allows investors a chance to get some of this interest. This is safe, this is intermediate risk, and this is very risky. This was the first set of collateralized debt obligations. Then the banks started taking these bottom tranches and putting them together with other tranches and started calling this safe and this risky. They basically started treating this type of collateralized debt obligation and this type of collateralized debt obligation as being the same thing, as being equally risky. But it's not. It's not equally risky because this collateralized debt obligation is built entirely on the risky tranches. This is actually starting to get rather complicated. This chapter is quite difficult if we really dive into it. But the logic that they had is not completely unreasonable. What they basically assumed was that perhaps this is Atlanta and this is San Diego, for example. And what the banks perhaps thought was happening is, you know, Atlanta may fail. Maybe Atlanta's housing market collapses. But if Atlanta's housing market's collapsing, San Diego's must be doing really well. For example, imagine if a bunch of people moved from Atlanta to San Diego. Then San Diego's housing market would do great, Atlanta's would do bad. Basic supply and demand would create that. Well then, if that's the case, the bottom one would get filled up at least in one of them, meaning this top one over here, even though it's filled up with these two risky tranches, would fill up too. But the problem is that's not what happened. Instead, all of these housing markets collapsed simultaneously. And so there were people who thought they were investing in safe tranches who instead, as these tranches began to fill, the bottom one wasn't getting filled anywhere across the United States. So all of these bottom tranches didn't get filled, which means that none of these collateralized debt obligations got any money coming in. So imagine if you've got a chunk of your retirement funds in this, you just lost a lot of money. Now you're going to stop spending so much money because you're poor. Now you can't retire when you wanted to. It's really a bleak moment in U.S. history. And the problem was these types of collateralized debt obligations. These have a particular name. This type of collateralized debt obligation is called a CDO squared. Collateralized debt obligation squared. The logic here is that basically you've done it twice, so it's like you've squared the CDO. If you've seen the movie The Big Short, which is a fantastic movie that covers this financial crisis, they spend a lot of time talking about these CDOs squared. And if I can find a good video, I'll send it to you guys in today's lecture notes. So, what we have now, as this economy starts to collapse, here's our economy in, let's say, 2009. 2009 was probably the heart of the recession. We were truly in a recession. We had, I think, 5 consecutive quarters of declining real GDP growth, which is a very long recession. Think about where we are at. Housing values are down, okay, which is bad for homeowners. Those that actually own houses, this is bad for them. Homeowners have lost equity, right? If you've got a $1 million home and you paid it in full, you're thinking, well, this $1 million represents a portion of my wealth. If that house is only worth now $350,000, kind of like you lost $650,000 in wealth. So the homeowners lost equity. Realtors can't find work. And the banks are losing money. And wow, are they losing money. Banks were doing horribly. Because who owns more houses than anyone? The banks, right? The banks have done all of these mortgages. In the case of a mortgage, the bank buys the house, so they own it, and people pay them back until they've paid it back in full. So when the housing market starts to collapse, the banks have tons of houses from all of these foreclosures. So the banks are losing money, and banks would have failed. Many banks would have failed, which would have been a catastrophe for our economy, except the government ended up stepping in and fighting this to some extent. So housing values are down. Investments are failing. So the stock market, for example, went way down. The Dow Jones Industrial Average went down by about half of its value. So imagine if you had, all of your life savings in stocks, and you have your money in there, and 3 months later, it's lost half of its value. What an absolute collapse. CDO values are down. Collateralized debt obligations, right? Lots of investors, lots of retirees have their money in these CDOs, whether or not they knew it, because it was part of their retirement plan, was to have a well-diversified portfolios that included CDOs. Well, because of because of the housing values being so poor and investments being so bad, right? These people don't have as much money as they did before. They're feeling poor. These homeowners, they feel poor because their house is worth less. And what do people do when they feel poor? They spend less. So spending is down. Spending, or aggregate demand decreases. This is the kind of thing Keynes was really worried about. What happens if aggregate demand goes down? It's bad news. Bad news for the economy. So people stopped spending so much, and they actually saved more. Even though the economy was terrible, even though people's wages went down, they actually increased their savings because they were so worried about the economy they didn't want to spend. So if spending goes down, that means the unemployment rate goes up because businesses can't make profits. So basically, everyone is adversely affected by this. There's really no place to stop in terms of there's no person really benefiting from this. Just about everybody is worse off. Another problem is tax revenue goes down. Government's tax revenues go down. Government's revenues come mainly from income taxes. People are earning less and not working as often. Tax revenues go down. So now the government is entering tremendous governmental debt. Just massive problems in our economy. Unemployment rate reached 10% in, I believe, 2009, which means that, if natural unemployment is 4.5%, then it means that 5.5% of the workforce was unemployed cyclically. So just an absolutely disastrous economy. In the next video, we're going to see what the government did to try to fix this tremendous problem that occurred.